woke up to an interesting piece today. Very randomly. I was actually reading a piece on Drake. Do you guys know who Drake is? Most of you, yeah, I know who Drake is. I wasn't familiar with Drake. You know who talks to me about Drake is Ariel Helwani. Drake is a Canadian, and so Ariel takes pride in him, I believe, is the connection there. But he's a artist of some kind of a singer. I think he raps, I think he sings, but he does it really well. And he's got a huge fan base. So I'm reading this thing on Drake. He made this big news because he just bought a jumbo plane that was worth like $100 million. So I'm reading this thing on Drake. And he's also, it's talking about all the stuff he's got, right? And he's got this house somewhere in California, but then the house has the largest pool in all of California that is commercial. The only place you can find a bigger pool is at some massive hotel in the city. So I'm reading all this stuff on Drake, and I get to the very bottom, and he's 32 years old. I thought it was interesting. I actually don't have a point there, other than this is what took me to the page, and the very next story that popped up was one on Steve Jobs, who I did think was a lot more interesting. So I read this piece on Steve Jobs, and right, Apple, founder of Apple, changed the world, literally changed the world, changed the way people live in a much more convenient manner. All the things that you can do right there in the palm of your hand. So when he died with $10 billion, right? Old Steve did great. Old Steve was a big financial success, but there was a party where you go, what do you mean $10 billion? This guy founded Apple, who's sitting on $1 trillion. What happened here? Well, it was interesting because of his $10 billion fortune, it didn't come from Apple. Here was the story. Steve Jobs started the company. He started with another guy named like Wozniak. I can't pronounce the guy's name. I think it's Wozniak. So these two start the company, but they have another partner. They have a third partner who nobody's ever heard about, and this guy owns 10% of the company. 2 weeks after Apple started, for reasons that I have no idea, it's like 1970, this partner sells his 10%, all of it, sells all 10% back to Jobs and Wozniak for less than $3,000. Okay, now that 10% today would be valued at 80 billion with a B dollars. So possibly the worst decision business-wise of all time that I've ever heard of. But they didn't know what it was. I imagine $3,000 was a ton of money to that guy back then. They had no idea. They had 3 guys in a garage playing with some wires. He didn't know. I get it. Well, Jobs goes into Apple and he starts to have some real success, and Apple starts to do well. And by reports, Jobs became a bit of a jerk. Good thinker, visionary, put in a lot of hours. I mean, plenty of compliments you could give him, but people were saying, look, he's just not friendly to work with. He's not nice. It's a hostile work environment. So even though Jobs was the founder and the owner, right, this is now a more public company, meaning he's got a board. The board voted him out. Boom, Jobs is out of the company. So what does he do? The very next day, he's so upset with Apple, he sells every share that he has, and he had millions of shares. And the company was only valued at $5 back then. So he sells all of the shares except for one. And the only reason he kept the one is because then he could continue to get letters on updates of the company, and he was curious. So all of those millions of shares at $5, I think it was like $15 million. And now Jobs doesn't know what to do with himself. He goes over to Europe and he starts roaming, and he goes and talks with the Russians and sees if he can be a civilian that goes up there at a shuttle about to go up. He wants to be a civilian astronaut. I don't even know how that worked out, but he doesn't know what to do with his time. He's bored. He doesn't know what to do with his time. So he comes back from Europe. He goes to Texas and he starts another tech company. And the company does okay, but nothing really that fantastic. It does okay. And then he's actually hemorrhaging a little bit of money. He partners with a guy named Ross Perot. You guys may remember Ross Perot. In 1992, he ran for president. He was winning in the polls. A lot of people thought that he was going to be president, and one day he just pulls out. He straight up pulls out of the campaign. 2 weeks later, he tries to reinsert himself. He never regained his ground. But Ross Perot was a famous oil man and a billionaire from Texas, and he teams up with Steve Jobs, and I just thought I would remind you guys of who he was in case that name rings a bell after I drop it. So, Steve Jobs keeps this little tech company alive. Apple, meanwhile, isn't doing so hot. And I remember Apple. I actually remember this time. I was in grade school. I never wanted to work on an Apple computer. Whenever they'd make us work, I go, why do we got to work on an Apple computer? Little computer, totally outdated. You're doing DOS. It was tough. And it would always have that little Apple on it. We got to go work on the Apple computers. It just wasn't this great. No, iPhone, that it wasn't even a term. Internet, not even a term. You would have thrown internet out back then. Nobody even know what you're talking about. So a different time. And some of the people at Apple, even the very people on the board that outed Jobs in the first place, kind of looked at it and go, look, we need Jobs back. Aside from him not being nice, the guy had a pretty good vision and we need him back. And they didn't know how to get him back. So Apple goes in and buys Jobs and Ross, whatever company that was they started, this little tech company. They go in and buy it for an exorbitant amount, but now they have Jobs. So they bring him back in, fast forward everything, and that's really where the world is at today. He went in, he did the iPhone, he did all of these great things, but Jobs wanted to be paid. He told them that, hey, you're going to have to pay me. You guys mistreated me. You threw me out of my own company. If you want me, you're going to have to pay me. But they didn't give him the shares. They ended up putting him on a salary. So when he died, what would have been hundreds or well over 100, according to this article, $billion ended up being $10 billion. And even though Jobs had changed the world and done some really wonderful things, he didn't have that same positioning in terms of the shares and the ownership that he previously had. So that went over to his wife, and that's expanded from there. And they talked, he did like $500 million just in dividends and some other kinds of options he had. But I thought it was a very interesting story. I didn't know that. I didn't know that Jobs had ever been outed from his own company and then they wanted him back in. And I didn't know when he came back in on salary instead of with the shares. I thought it was an interesting article.